We're not moving. 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth. That's what slavery did to you. It maldistributed everything in the hands of the dominant white society. And as an example, you didn't acquire any wealth since 1860. Let me show you some other indications. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, almost 99% of all the black people in America, slave and free, was working for whites. Either in a white corporation, in a white business, in some white office, making wealth comfort for whites, on a plantation or whatever it is. Here you are, 140 years later, and again, 98% of all the black people in America work for whites. They either worked in some level of government, white businesses, city government, state government, school teaching. Only 2% of all the blacks in America work in their own communities for themselves. Only 2% work for themselves. You haven't changed in 140 years. Let me try it another way if you still don't understand my point. On the eve of the Civil War in 1860, again, at that time, going and looking at all the prisons in the United States and examine their records, I found out in the records, when I looked in the prisons in Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, Washington, D.C., looked at all the prisons, and I found out at that time, even though only 287,000 blacks were free, blacks made up over 51% of all the prisoners. You weren't even free and you made up 51% of the prisoners. Now I look around 140 years later, today, and I still find black folk make up over 51% of all the prisoners. Where have you changed? You don't own anything. You're still in prison. Still work for other people. You're enjoying a social illusion. Now you're fat and happy because we can go to someone else's restaurant. We can go to someone else's school. We can go to someone else's hotel. We can live in someone else's community. And we don't understand the negative aspects of that. That is a death sentence. And we don't understand what racism is. So what we are doing is committing suicide. We got 3 years ago before we go into it. 3 years ago, before you're gonna see massive suicides happening. Because you don't even understand what racism is. I've gone all around the world. Even when I was with President Carter in the White House, I had to take trade missions in the third world nations, in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. And invariably, wherever I spoke, I would ask people, do you know what racism is? I would even offer $1,000 for a person to tell me what racism is. I still got black folk today don't even know what racism is. They talk about it. Find me one that understands what racism is. Every time I ask them, what is racism? Well, Dr. Anderson, racism is not liking somebody. It's prejudice, it's bigotry, it's hatred. No, it's not. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups of people that are competing for the ownership and control of wealth and resources and power. That's what racism is. Racism is a group phenomenon. Racism is a team sport. You cannot participate in racism if you don't play as a team. You can't correct it. You're not even in the game. Racism is like football, basketball, and baseball. You play as a team or you lose. And I got all these so-called educated blacks in America on TV, heading up civil rights organizations, getting elected to public office. Don't you understand what racism is? That's why they don't do anything. They go there and tell you, well, I'm in a public office now, I'm a mayor or governor. My thing is to make sure everybody get along. That's not affecting racism. Nobody asked you to get elected to office to make people get along. Now, racism never existed on the earth until the 1400s. Never had it. There was no such thing as racism. You had people, for instance, who had practiced various forms of discrimination. We even had slavery. But to be enslaved prior to the 1400s, for only 3 reasons. Either you were a victim of a religious persecution, or you had some indebtedness, it was enslaved, or you were a prisoner of war. Those are the only 3 reasons you could be enslaved. until the 1400s. About 1442, when Magellan, he went around, Henry the Navigator rather, went around the coast of Africa and picked up about 16 blacks and brought them back in 1442 and gave them to the Pope as gifts. And those slaves worked around the Vatican in Italy from 1442 and about 1488. And it became a good thing to have all these blacks working free around the Vatican and in the Pope's space. No labor to be paid for. Other people wanted those advantages. So Pope Pius put out a public edict. Pope Innocent put out a public edict saying, look, if you want some slaves, go get some, but get black folk. He put out a public edict saying, if you're going to enslave anybody, enslave black people. And once that hit, all of a sudden everybody got interested in getting slaves. And that started the whole movement in 1488 and 1489. Now, something happened very important in 1495. Y'all know what happened in 1495? Allegedly, for this guy who was over here looking for drugs and some other thing. What was his name? Columbus. Y'all remember that guy? Now, he came over here and he supposedly discovered America about 7 years after the Pope had put out his edict using blacks as slaves. Now, all of a sudden, he goes back to Europe. A race started. All these countries got into a race to develop the Western world that Columbus said he had discovered. And what was the race about? They wanted to colonize and get resources, wealth, gold, silver, and cash crops from the West, because they never knew that the Americas existed. People in Europe never knew that there was a North America, Central America, and a South America. They got into a contest to explore it and to find it and profit from it. And because at that time, prior to that, thank you, sir. Prior to that, the only, can you all hear me as well without this? Which one do you need? You need this one? Okay. So prior to that time, they had Europe all through the 1400s, was going through what's called the Dark Ages. Europe was crime-ridden, impoverished, diseased, and they said we can resuscitate Europe, we can strengthen this continent, and we can find a way to develop the Western world, the Americas, Latin America, Central America, North America. If we can develop that country, we can bring ourselves out of the ditch as an European continent. And so they all said, well, how are we going to do it? They said, we need a labor class. So they all rushed down and picked up the Pope's edict and started grabbing blacks off the west coast of Africa. It was picking those blacks up on average about $25 a piece. And they started setting up, so they want a 1,500% return on their money. They started selling them for $400-some a piece. And so they started shipping blacks all into this country in Latin America and Central America to put them to work as a labor class. Now, the countries that started at race, it started with Arabs. Arabs were the first ones that started enslaving black folk. I don't know if you all know that or not. Arabs were the first ones that started enslaving black folk, and Arabs have been enslaving black folk now for 1,300 years. Arabs first started enslaving blacks in 765 AD when they marched into Africa in what they called in search of the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold. And they pursued Africa until the 12th century when they overtook Timbuktu and Timbuktu fell, then they started dominating Africa. But the Arabs were the first ones. Portuguese were the second ones. Hispanics were the third ones. Then the Germans and the Danes. Then the French. Then the English. The Norwegians on down the line. Then lastly was the American Indians. Everybody's enslaved black folk. And that's what a race was. A contest started to develop the Western world. The rule was he who gets there first with the most slaves and make the most money will be the most powerful nation on earth. And the race began. Everybody was in the race to use